Okay. George watched a girl pour water onto a campfire. The fire fizzled out. George thought that looked like fun. He poured his bucket onto the next campfire. Hey, yelled the camper. We weren't finished with that yet. The camper began to chase George, but George didn't mean to cause trouble. Now, he only wanted to hide. He ran into the forest and as fast as he could, but the camper's footsteps followed close behind. George ran faster and faster. The footsteps came closer and closer until suddenly they were passing George. Why it was not the camper that was chasing George, it was a deer. What fun to run with a deer. Forgetting all about the camper and the marshmallows, George ran after the deer. But a little monkey cannot run as fast as a deer in the woods. Before long, George was lost and all alone. He felt tired and stopped to rest. At first, he was worried. He was very far from camp. But there were lots of animals that kept him company. He saw a lizard sunning on a rock and a squirrel chattering in a tree. Then he saw the tail of a black and white kitty peeking out from under a bush. He was curious. Would the kitty like to play? George gently pulled the kitty out, but it was not a kitty. You know what it was, Valerie? Skunk. It was a skunk, and it was scared. The skunk lifted its tail and sprayed. Whew. The spray smelled awful. The animals tried to get away. George wanted to get away too, but he could not. The smell was all over him. How could he ever get rid of this awful smell, he wondered. Too bad. He could not take a bath in the woods. Then George had an idea. He could wash the smell off in the creek. George jumped into the cold water. He splashed and scrubbed. But he was still smelly, and now he was wet too. But what could he do? George thought and thought. If he climbed up into a tree to dry off, would the smell blow away? No. Even dry and high up in a tree, George did not smell better. Poor George. He wished that he hadn't wandered off so far from camp. He wished he was roasting marshmallows. With his friend. Suddenly, George heard footsteps heading toward him. Someone was coming. It was the forest animals, but they ran right by him. They had seen something scary, and George saw it too. It was fire. George had gotten into trouble for putting out one fire, but this fire wasn't on the campground. This was an emergency. Quickly, George climbed down the tree and grabbed his bucket. He scooped it full of water from the creek. Then, being careful not to spill, he climbed back up, swung from a branch through the trees. When George got close enough to the fire, he reached down and poured water onto the flames. Out with the flame in a big hiss. Just then, George's friend rushed out of the forest with a ranger. "George," he called, "I was afraid you would be here." "It's a good thing you were here, George," the ranger said. "We saw smoke from the campground, but you put the fire out just in time." George was glad to help, and the man with the yellow hat was glad to see George was safe. But he had a funny look on his face. "George, what's that smell?" Back at the campsite, George's friend helped him get rid of that awful smell. After a strange bath in tomato juice, George smelled just fine. Then the man in the yellow hat invited the ranger to cook dinner with them over their own small campfire. "Fires can be nice if you're careful," said the ranger. George agreed, especially for roasted marshmallows. The end. All right, that's a wrap.